Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the VSI webinar series. Today, we're going to be looking at crisis leadership. We have actually invited Boris Johnson and Public Health England onto this webinar today, but we're not entirely sure whether they're going to be joining us. But for those who join us regularly, you know how it works. I'm going to hand you over to Tim, who will explain how you can ask questions and get engaged, and Tim will hand straight over to Dr. Ian Lawrence, who will then be in discussion around crisis leadership with the two guests today. So Tim, over to you.
Cheers, Tony. So as always, if you're watching this on YouTube, please don't ask any questions because they will not come through. We will not answer them. If you're lucky enough to be an attendant on the Zoom call itself, and we do have a few, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A or the chat box at the bottom, and we will ask them later on. And without further ado, I can pass this straight over to Mr. Ian Lawrence, who is sat there poised, ready to go and take on the world.
Thanks, Tim. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We have two very special guests with us, Pete Briggs and Carl Ingham. Little introduction about both of our guests. Pete is a former warrant officer, Class 2 in the Royal Military Police. Pete joined the British Army aged 19, being posted all over the world, including service in Iraq and as a UN peacekeeping tour in Kosovo. Since leaving the Army, Pete's been working as a leadership and management training assessor, as well as applying his leadership skills to the Premier League as a professional skills coach. I'd also like to welcome Major Carl Ingham. Carl has 16 years worth of military service, 7 as a mechanical engineer, and most recently served as a Royal Military Police officer and close protection team leader. Carl has been on operational tours to Iraq and Afghanistan, and also helped plan and deliver special to arm training for UK military police personnel. And that's preparation that's become pretty much, I think, the benchmark training activity across the Royal Military Police. So starting off with Carl, the military have a track record of supporting the UK government in a crisis: floods, fires, bomb disposal operations, supporting the Home Office with their counter-terrorism operations, and now the pandemic. Do you have any concerns regarding the possibility of the military having to support the police with their public order activities? And I'm thinking in particular about, in northern Italy, army personnel have been on the streets taking part in enforcing lockdown.
Yes, I think is probably the short answer. Why? So the Italian example is a good one, although you need to understand that the Italian Carabinieri are a gendarmerie type force, so they have policing powers in Italy. So for an Italian to see military police or soldiers on the streets is normal. So it doesn't quite have the shock factor that it would do for us in the UK. So with that in mind, we can conduct public order role. I don't think we would want to do it in the UK, and I don't think the UK would want us to do it either. So where we do offer utility, though, as you alluded to, is in those other areas. So planning and delivery of activity, examples such as the building of the Nightingale hospitals. So that's the sort of thing that we can get involved in more willingly. I think that's things that the public are happy to see us doing, and they like seeing us doing, such as putting out fires and helping with flood support activities earlier in the year. But public order and that sort of activity, I don't really see a role for us in the UK at the moment.
Do you think, Carl, the armed forces get enough credit for what they're doing at the moment in terms of the support that they're supplying the government with in terms of Operation Rescript? Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but my research says that there's something like 20,000 military personnel from all services supporting the government. Do they get enough credit?
I think so. I think it's that sort of keeping the military in the public eye kind of activity. So I think everybody that's contributing to Rescript or contributing to the national effort that is the COVID crisis, I think deserves equal measures of what's the word I'm looking for? Of recognition. I think people are happy having soldiers out there. I mean, you'd have seen some of the pop-up test centres and things like that, where they were manned by military personnel as well. So people are now more used to seeing the military in the public eye, and equally, I think generally the consensus is very supportive. I think if we switch to a more security force type role, I think we would lose that that goodwill and that support very quickly. And that's probably not, again, that's one of those supporting arguments as to why we are probably not best placed to be used in that kind of role. I don't know if that answers the question or not, if that's okay.
No, that's interesting, Carl. Pete, I've got an easy one for you to start you off in terms of now that you've retired from the military and you're doing other things. Has the government done a good job so far, in your opinion? How would you judge it?
Well, I think there's two answers to this question. I think the leadership are in government, and maybe some of those that are advising the government probably hasn't been to the highest standards. We in the army, I say we in the army, I'm not in it anymore, but in the army, you always led by example. You wouldn't expect people to be able to follow your lead if you didn't toe the line. And I think as a leader, it should be expected that if you say you're not to do something, then that should be followed. I understand, you know, circumstances and people's circumstances change and differ, and have changed throughout this whole pandemic. However, there are challenges that should be seen by the government as being something they cannot breach. From a personal perspective, I would have liked to see more leadership, more interaction, more direction from the Prime Minister. I think some of his advisors probably have breached maybe the trust that he'd put inside them, and the trust that the government, the country had given them as well. On the idea that we've done a good job nationally, though, I mean, I think the idea that we haven't had too many instances of too much public order disturbances, and you know, there may be an argument to suggest the demonstrations we've had in the UK with Black Lives Matter and the subsequent counter demonstrations have been as a consequence of maybe the lockdown itself. I still think that we've walked a very, very thin tightrope across what we could have done, which is a complete lockdown with a military presence, forcing people home. And you must admit, you know, and we must know that if you invite the army to go and do something like that, then the army doesn't cut any corners. It is black and white. You either are in your house or you're not. I think the way that we've policed it has been intelligent, and I know the police get a lot of the scrutiny and a lot of media focus, but I think they've done a pretty brilliant job under the circumstances, because this has been a tremendously hard time for those people that are working at that coalface. They've got their own families to look after, and the people that they're living with, they've got themselves to look after as well, and they still go out every single day. And I think some of the messaging that has come from the government has helped the public understand how hard this has been for everybody, and allowed us to walk a very thin tightrope between our liberal and socialism and our rights as individuals.
Similar question that I posed to Carl a second ago, Pete. Are you relieved that we don't have tanks rolling up the M6 at the moment?
I think there's only one outcome to that, and you know, if you have weapons on the streets in the hands of soldiers, and tanks and armored vehicles in places like Manchester or Leeds, the threat can only go so far. You can't threaten without it being followed up. So if the public don't do what you're told, then how would we react to British servicemen killing civilians on the streets of Manchester? And you would go back to Peterloo. I just can't see how, as a nation, we would have that goodwill to the armed forces if push come to shove and we had to make those decisions. The army can't back down. You can't roll a tank into Manchester and then and just ignore the threat. If we don't have water cannons in London because of what damage it can be done to other individuals, then there's no way the tank can do the same thing.
Thanks for that, Pete. Carl, in terms of the topic of today, we're talking broadly around crisis and crisis management. We're going to get onto that in a second. Do you think that this is a crisis from a military perspective in terms of the kind of activities and the kind of exercises that you've been on the past? Are there any similarities in terms of the behaviour towards how the government has handled this crisis and how the military is involved, and your own personal experience in the past?
I've got some experience of UK resilience activity, and I suppose it does draw some parallels with that. And I think our supporting role is, as we said earlier, is the right role. I don't foresee a position at the moment, despite, yes, probably is a national crisis. I don't see there being a requirement to have the military in charge of it in any capacity. So we're very good at supporting civilian infrastructure, and from my experience, that's something that we're really good at contributing towards. But in terms of routine military activity and exercises and things like that, like, yes, we train to work with the civilian agencies, but the majority of our exercises and training is against a conventional military type threat, and this is not that kind of environment. So no. So I think we, as Pete alluded to, we do have some things that we can roll out and use, but this is not like routine business for us. Which is why we're probably, again, not the most suitable to be running the response to it.
Pete, is the skill of the army in this situation then their ability and their focus upon planning and the fundamental need to plan and scenario plan moving forward?
I would probably say yes to that, to be honest. I think every soldier from non-commissioned officer all the way up to our senior officers are all trained in varying degrees to plan. Whether we're planning our next action, we're planning 2, 3, 4 months in advance. I always like the analogy that in the army, if you've got nothing to do, you plan. And I know a lot of officers, if they've got no portfolio, they often just get told to sort of plan an activity that might never even happen, and it might take 3, 4 months of their time to go and do that and go away and sort of liaise with all the different agencies. So the British Army, I mean, it works really well with planning. It's got planning at its core. We used to, I used to do a lot of exercises on planning, 4 or 5 days worth of activity where you would go through an entire 7 questions process in understanding what the situation was and then plan for it. The British Army is really great at doing 2 things at once. So everyone has a job, everyone has a task. All the sergeant majors and the officer commandings will run away with their soldiers. They prepare them to go away, and that'll be a finite period of time. So me and Carl worked in Colchester. We had notice to move periods. So we were on 48 hours and 5 days notice to move anywhere in the world. And as a result, it gave everyone a timeline, a planning timeline to ensure that the plan was conducted and set ready for that period of time to be concluded. And me and Carl would go away. We plan our activity, and we made sure all our soldiers were ready to go out the door. They had the right equipment, they had the right armor, they had the right resources, they had the right injections, all that sort of thing that would go on in that small period of time, where everyone else was planning and producing the information necessary that when we actually got into theatre, that plan was out ready for us to roll out across the board. So planning for us is always the most important thing for us, to be honest. Every NCO will plan, and our planning can go from, we're either going to right flank the enemy, we're going to left flank the enemy, or we're just going to go over the top. We'll cause a little bit of diversion somewhere, all the way down to complex planning where you have mass numbers of troops moving in conjunction with other missions that are going on at the same time. So that's really important for us that we can manage that and we can provide that to the civilian authorities.
Carl, can you talk us through the process by which you plan contingencies. And I'm thinking in particular about, the plan is nothing. I'm in research and preparation for today. There's lots of great quotes surrounding planning and what the army do, what the military do. But a plan never survives first contact with the enemy. So given the importance of contingency planning, how do you go about doing that?
So as Pete's alluded to, so the planning process is something that we know and understand, and everyone's trained to different levels to be able to deliver that plan. So if we said that the plan is sort of like in one hand, and this is what we know, what we want to do, and what we think is going to happen. Obviously, then your contingency plans against an operational or tactical action are for when either the plan doesn't work or something unexpected happens. So, for instance, I'm trying to think of an example. So obviously we have a timeline of activity, and that might not necessarily be time as in a 24-hour clock. It might just be in whole hours. So H hour would be the start of the operation. So H plus 4, you would expect to see something happening, and that's a prediction that can be drawn from intelligence, from situational awareness, from sensors, or whatever. But if something then doesn't happen at that point, so H plus 4, the enemy isn't where you expect, or your people aren't, potentially you would then use your comm plan. Having worked through it earlier and tested it, then, and obviously the test is the key for a contingency plan. It has to be tested, be rehearsed, and it has to be validated in order to be viable. Then as long as everyone's aware of it, you can then just go, right, we're now going to go to comm plan 1. And this hasn't happened. This is what we need to use and what we want to achieve. So we kind of have, you'll have your primary plan again, and then you have a shelf with your contingency plans on. They might be very small. They might be fairly generic. So for instance, I don't know, like an aircraft crash, for instance, it's something that could be an applicable comm plan to multiple scenarios. So who needs to go and deal with it, and how? That's on the shelf somewhere. But if you've got a more bespoke solution that's required, again, then there's a dedicated team that will work on that contingency plan and validate it before it's put on the shelf to be used, or hopefully not used at a later point. So we do have kind of a portfolio of things to use in terms of contingency planning. So that's a contingency that will be in a preset scenario, so where we've got time to conduct that activity. But you also have, as Pete's alluded to, you have people that are on standby while an operation's running, that should the plan completely fail or not go as we hoped, you've got people that you can pull out from their other activity, be that planning a future operation or sat in the ops room. You'll pull them to one side, so the operation continues, and then you have this little pool of people that can then work exclusively on a quick fire plan and how to deal with that problem or that scenario as it stands at that moment in time. I suppose from a leadership perspective, when it comes to comm plans or running a battle, for lack of a better description, the leadership here is key, because obviously if there's something that's happening that you hadn't foreseen, it's very easy for the commander potentially to try and get involved in that. And the discipline and where the training kicks in is your ability to stand back and observe, because by taking that time to pull yourself away, you can generate situational awareness and you can make an informed decision. If you're looking down a very narrow lens at the incident on the ground, then you're missing kind of that bigger picture or that broader picture. So by having the ability to plan in isolation and know that and have trust in the people that are delivering the operation at the time, means that you can look at both elements at the same time. Does that make sense? We try and have a balance.
Sure.
Try and have a balance between both. And I suppose from that perspective, that's something that can only come with time and experience as well. Because I said the law, I mean, similar to, let's use a football analogy, but like sort of children chasing the ball, you don't want to be in that scenario as the commander or the director of that activity. You don't want to be chasing the ball. You need to kind of distance yourself, be able to see the whole environment and appreciate it for what it is, in order that you can make a proper decision or enact a comm plan that's going to result in success.
Pete, can you ever be 100% confident in terms of your scenario planning, your contingency planning, when the reality is that the environment in which you are preparing is going to be different, probably in most cases, to the one that maybe the contingency plan is preparing for? And I'm thinking about, in terms of black and white situations, of planning in terms of preparation in training and planning, as opposed to how those plans then convert into warfare, say, for instance, or in battle. Can you ever completely replicate? I wouldn't have thought you can you?
It's very hard to. Just to add to what Carl was saying there, which will probably answer a fraction of this question, is that we've got a lot of policies and a lot of tactics already set out for ourselves all the time. So in actual fact, when you are in that situation where you need to take a knee, a lot of your decision making has already been delivered by the people on the ground. They know what they're doing, they know what they're going to do. So if you say, I want you to go right, they know exactly how far to go right, what they're going to use to go right, who's going to create the diversion, how they're going to enter the building, and how they're going to, or the compound, or whatever it is. So although your decision is whether you're going right or left or down the center, the actual tactics are already they've been practiced and delivered constantly. Terrain is often just an obstacle. When on my first tour of Iraq, we were going out in Catterick, it was January, it was snowing, we were wearing gloves. I got told not to wear gloves because that was not what we'd be wearing in Iraq. It just becomes a little bit silly because it's so cold and you can't replicate what you're going to be doing on operations in that foreign country. So what happens is that you just have to fit your circumstances to the terrain or the obstacle that you're coming across. Your tactics generally don't change, only the delivery of that tactic. And the soldier, we try and train our soldier in order to make those decisions, split decisions at the time, to be able to combat all those little differences between, whether you're training in Canada or you're training in Catterick or you're actually on operations in Iraq or Afghanistan. Ultimately, the enemy is still firing, you still need to get cover, and you still need to create a diversion so then you can attack them from another point and kill them. That ultimately is the objective of the entire game. So it doesn't matter where you are, all it is just an obstacle to overcome.
Carl, is one of the components then of training, because one of the maxims that you take from professional sport, which I guess applies to you guys and vice versa, is that you train and prepare the way you intend to play, to try and make sure that your training mirrors the ultimate performance objectives that you have. One of the things which I've read about, which seems to typically define what the military do, is their high tempo in terms of the training. Can you elaborate what that is?
So tempo sort of relates to a couple of areas really. So, or it can be generated a number of ways. So the primary one, and we may have found from your research, is kind of a mindset or an attitude creates tempo. So we're notoriously optimistic in the military. In the plan will always work, and we're going to have success, and we'll just get through it by grit and by guile. We'll get there. And that kind of builds some tempo because it's motivating, that you wouldn't want to go and do it if you thought there was a chance you wouldn't succeed. So you have to be a little bit optimistic. But equally, the process that we follow, as Pete's alluded to, so during the planning process, there's a lot of concurrent activity. And concurrent activity is one of the 10 principles of war that we teach our soldiers. And by preparing for something during the planning process, it means that you can plan and prepare at the same time. So we drip feed information through the form of a warning order during the planning process. The 2 or 3 of these will go out. So they give people a little bit of an indication about the likely tasks they'll be doing, where they'll be doing it, and what time they'll be doing it. So while you're sat in a dark room somewhere working up this beautifully elaborate plan, the people are already ready, and that creates tempo. And because one of the problems, what you don't want to do is you don't want to plan in isolation and then go through a full period of preparation and then go and conduct the operation. You need to be able to generate both things simultaneously in order to achieve the effect in the shortest possible time. So attitude is another way. We're very can-do, we're very optimistic. There's a bit of positivity in that nothing can't be overcome through application of force, a liberal application or explosives, or just a willingness to succeed. I think that's one of a few of the sort of mantras that we kind of live by. So tempo is good. It needs to be measured though, because you can get too far into the planning process, or too far into your stovepipe of activity if you're solely focused on that and you're not looking at the bigger picture again, like we spoke about earlier. So tempo, you do need to be careful with it, that you're not sort of running off in the wrong direction in terms of planning and activity. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. But yeah, tempo in terms of planning is generated through various things, and it's definitely a way of trying to get ahead of the enemy, or ahead of the problem, for lack of a better description.
Pete, how mindful do you need to be when you are preparing your soldiers, in terms of, you have this objective of high tempo, but at the same time that's going to impact upon decision making? I'm thinking about fatigue at this stage. So how do you balance those two things?
Fatigue is an important part of training, because you're going to be fatigued on operations. So in actual fact, it's a training complexity that we always try to add to our exercises, or any of our training that we do. And we build training in steps. You start really low level. You just start talking about the theory, how we're going to do something. You sort of flex out maybe some of the decisions that a commander might want to see from their troops, from that theory, from the doctrine that we've got, that is probably, it's all encompassing, is the doctrine, the policies that the army produces. All our instructors are all trained in the same environment. So all our skill at arms instructors and all our MQuALD individuals are all trained in the same schools. So they all come back to the units with the same ideas and the same thought processes and the same tactics. And then you sort of build your own tactics around it. Then you go and do it maybe in a grassy field or a car park where you can just do dry drills. You just go it very slowly, you break down the actions. So you might just do that really easily and simply. And then you start building it up and adding those complexities. So then you start bringing ammunition in, blank ammunition in. You might be doing it where you have to cook your own food. Then you start sleeping and living in a hole in the ground while you're holding ammunition. Then you reduce the sleep. So you no longer have that ability to think clearly, because you're almost living in a fog of war. And when you're on exercise for 4 to 6 weeks, living in a hole in the ground, not the same hole every night. You're going to move and dig your own hole another night and another night and another night. And sometimes you're digging 2 or 3 holes a night. You've got sentries all night long. You've got night operations, because we'll operate mainly at night rather than during the day, because it's easier to conceal yourself. So all those things you start adding in, and the only thing you lose is sleep. So that fatigue, that drawdown is an important part of training, because when you go on operations, all that is going to be still true. You're still going to be digging lots of holes. You're still going to be working at night. You're not going to be eating as good as you are at home, with your wife cooking you a nice meal. You're going to be eating rations cooked in a boil in a bag. If you're lucky to get it hot, you're just eating it cold most of the time. You just grab little bits of morale wherever you can. And that creates the tempo. That creates that mindset, creates a team ethos, because you're all in it. You're dragged down into the very basement of your morale almost, and you keep your own morale lifted by everybody else. Such an important part of training. And then that is reflected in our operations when we go away as well. You've seen it on TV where you look at soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq, and they just look absolutely exhausted. They're tired, they're drawn, they're worn out. Their clothes look a mess because they haven't washed their clothes. They're wearing the same kit that they've worn for the last 6-7 days in a row. That's the sort of exhaustion you're trying to create in on exercise. Some of the big, large-scale exercises in Kenya and Canada and Poland, they try and replicate those to the strongest degree possible within safety reasons. We have to obviously maintain health and safety as well at the same time. So especially when you were using live weapons and live ammunition, how safe is everybody? I mean, we've all been involved in training exercises where we've had fatalities. You have to maintain the highest level of safety, but also try and keep it as realistic as possible.
Talking of realism, Carl, how realistic for most of us, we'll get our insight into what goes on in the military through programs such as, you know, the documentaries on TV and probably most recently Ant Middleton's celebrity SAS. How realistic is it in terms of the conditions and the intensity for the people on that show?
I think it is realistic, and I think anyone that says that, oh well, like, especially for the celebrity version, oh well, they've got it easy or they're taking it easy on them. I mean, you need to be aware that they don't just turn up and do those individual activities. They're living in a freezing cold farmhouse in Scotland. There's no central heating. There's one wood burning stove in the corner of the room, and they're eating when they're told to eat, and that's all they're getting. So it's very similar to when we sort of we live in an expeditious manner or expeditionary manner, and that's kind of how we live. And that alone is fatiguing. That's without going and doing physical activity or operating. Just living in a cold farmhouse, if you're not used to it, or showering collectively with cold water, that's fatiguing. So yeah, I think there is an element of realism that comes from the sort of the SAS programs. I think that shouldn't be underestimated, and that the physical activities that they're conducting are hard, very hard, and rightly so. Otherwise, it wouldn't be worth watching, would it? Yeah, I think it's true, or true enough anyway, that it gives the right impression. That's for sure.
Is part of the goal, and I guess alluding to what we've already discussed, but touching upon muscle memory and trying to make actions instinctive when you're under pressure?
Yeah, I think so. I think, as Pete alluded to, so you need to make that training environment as realistic as you possibly can, and obviously stealing sleep from people is one of the easiest things we can do. So we just instigate sort of 24-hour cycles of activity, interrupt their sleep regularly, whether that's during the day or at night, and that kind of, as you say, builds that muscle memory, and it gets them used to operating in that fatigued state. I mean, there's a bit of an adage that we sort of talk about on various courses that the 60% solution delivered aggressively is enough. And I think physical performance kind of drops down to a similar standard. If you're fatigued for long enough, you'll get to that sort of 50 or 60% capacity, and you don't really have anything else to give. But you can stay at that for a while if you're used to it, and you'll know that your decision making will be impaired. So you'll need to take longer to make a decision, or you'll seek suitable advice, be that from peers or subordinates. If you've been in that state for a very, very long time, as you say, it's very hard to make a truly informed decision. And yeah, that's kind of how we get around it. I suppose it's accepting that you are fatigued and maybe you are going to make mistakes, but there are people out there that can help you, and by training for it, hopefully you avoid those mistakes.
Pete, in your experience of working with people both in the military and now outside of the military, what are the characteristics that make leaders stand out? And I'm thinking in terms of maybe things that you've seen previously in the military and now you're a little bit more sensitive to outside of it, and maybe not the same range of qualities. I don't know.
The military is drawn from all walks of our society. So we all have individuals that sort of are good managers and bad managers. The military has bad managers as well as good managers. What the military is able to do well is like Carl just said there, it's a symbiotic relationship between not just the hierarchy, the chain of command, but also with your team as well. Any good commander should be listening to their individuals on the team, listening to their feedback. We were talking about this before this today. it makes you think differently. A lot of soldiers will think they need to do it the way that they've always done it. And that's not always the correct way of doing it. So by bringing in new blood, by bringing in people that may not have as much experience for you, might just give you a different perspective. That challenges the leaders to have to think differently constantly, because you don't want to be sat there asking people of a lower rank and then almost getting a better decision from those individuals. You have to think better and faster and more thoroughly. I think in the civilian world, I think there's a lot of talk about leadership, but there's not a lot of practice about leadership. Whereas in the military, if you don't have leadership, people won't follow you. They might follow you as long as you've got a bit of rank, but it won't be long before you get found out and people start turning against you quite quickly. And the military is full of strong characters who will have no qualms about stepping outside of their rank system and briefing you up if necessary. So in civilian life, I think there's a lot of talk about leadership. I think there's a lot of theory, but in practice, it's probably not as well defined as it may be in the army. Mainly because if you make a bad decision in Iraq or Afghanistan, it could lead to the death of the soldiers. And if you make a bad decision in civilian street, it might just make your dinner hour shorter or something. It just ends up a little bit less. I wouldn't say important, because I don't think that's the correct word, but less life-threatening, maybe.
And Carl, for you, who are the people within the military that maybe you've worked alongside of, or you've been connected to, that you have a lot of respect for in terms of leadership qualities? What makes them stand out?
I think honesty and integrity are those sort of the key tenets of good leadership. I think we spend a lot of time in the military sort of training leadership, if you can do that. And as Pete's alluded to, like when the chips are down, like that's when real leaders kind of come to the fore. But you need to have built up that trust with your team beforehand. And I think the key things for me are honesty and integrity. And that's not to say that in terms of either integrity, you don't have to be completely infallible, because we're all human. But if you do make a mistake, then that's when the opportunity to be honest is very, very important. Be honest with yourself and with your people. And I think people will accept that if it's an honest mistake. And equally, that kind of builds on that trust, because people will see you make the mistake. They'll see you hopefully learn from it. And that should all make the team and you better as a result. I think that's probably the key tenets. In terms of other things, so good leaders that I've come across, I think really good leaders have presence as well. And again, it's probably not something that you can train or teach. They just kind of have it, like a natural flair, for instance. But if you've got an individual like that, when they come into the room, there's an immediate sort of collective feeling that what you're going to be doing. Again, it kind of supports the attitude argument that we were talking about earlier. It builds that optimism, and you're confident that this individual is going to make the right decision, and there'll be a success at the end of it.
Pete, bit of a cheeky, provocative question for you. Would Dominic Cummings or Boris Johnson have benefited from a time at Standhurst?
Yeah, I'm glad you didn't ask Carl this one.
No, I deliberately avoided that one from Carl.
I think, Dominic Cummings failed in a leadership position, but he's never been elected into a leadership position. He's an advisor to the government, and maybe something that, the leadership of the Conservative Party and who they're taking advice from. Remember, he's a strategic advisor. So he thinks long term. He's not somebody that can make good, quick decisions. I think he's a long-term strategist. He clearly breached the rules. I don't really have as much problem with going to Durham with his family if he's ill, but the whole Bernard Castle situation probably was a step too far and a stretch to suggest he's driving a vehicle while he might be visually impaired. So I think from that point of view, yes, a little bit of integrity and a little bit of honesty, just to stand up and say, yes, there was a mistake. As soon as that came out, yep, we've made a mistake. This is the problem. We're going to rectify it. Probably would have put that to bed a lot quicker than just dragging it out and trying to pretend it didn't happen for such a long period of time. I think the whole period of time when Boris Johnson was incapacitated in hospital, we were rudderless for the entire period of time. We didn't really see enough leadership from across the party, someone to grab the situation by the scruff of the neck and really push through some of the more important policies that needed to be established at that point. We just sort of existed for 2 weeks, really, without anybody really bringing anything to the table. So yeah, I do think that with a little bit of quality training, and I wouldn't even say military training, just leadership training, understanding leadership, what should be the most important part. It's not them, it's the people of this country. It's the people on the NHS wards. It's the people. It's the police in the streets. It's the fire people. That's still going out and doing their job. All those individuals. They were the most important part. Not maybe Dominic Cummings' eyesight.
Carl, I'll ask you a little bit of a more straightforward question, given that you're currently still serving in the military. Given that there's been a lot of talk in the press recently and within research circles regarding the unicorn leader. Does the military have a unicorn leader in terms of, in every regiment and in every division, somebody who is this totemic person who takes charge, or has, and I should sort of discuss about politics here, but has the current situation revealed that the organizations that are the most resilient are the ones that have a pool of leadership within their team? And does the Army recognise that?
I think so. I think I don't know whether the unicorn effect is something that we would support. But hopefully by the nature of the way that we progress through our careers, that the right people are in the right places at the right time. And what that gives us the ability then, hopefully, that with the right experience and the right knowledge, that you can make the right decision on a bad day. I think that kind of makes us a little bit more resilient. And I suppose industry is the same. I mean, like the NHS or the health service, for instance, is used to working in what's the word? In difficult circumstances. I mean, there have been sort of cries of funding shortages, staff shortages, bed numbers insufficient for the demand and things like that. So they're used to working with difficulty. And in order to get through that, yes, there must be, these individuals are out there and they exist in these organisations. I suppose whether they're in the right positions or not, I can't answer. But they must be there because they're getting through it. This state is not a new state for the health service. Every winter we go through flu pandemic issues and overworked A&E departments. So they're used to being overwhelmed. And yeah, I think the right people may be in the right place, and that's how we get through it together. I don't know if that answers your question, Ian, so sorry, but that's kind of my view on I suppose on the unicorn thing. I don't know. I mean, in terms of character, I mean, you can have a unicorn character within the organisation, and people, as he's alluded to beforehand, you have those characters within your platoons, or those individuals that aren't afraid to stand up and tell you when you've done something wrong. Ideally, not publicly. They'll take you to one side and let you know after the event. But yeah, that kind of helps you out, and that makes you more resilient, because that's the sort of humbling element of being able to know when you have done wrong and learning from it. I think they do exist. Whether they're in leadership roles, again, I don't know. Yeah,
Pete, just following on from what Carl said about having the right characters within your organisation, one of my favourite phrases is recruitment with integrity. How do you make sure, how does the military make sure that it has the right people with the right character that you can build trust with and build skills with?
I don't think that the British Army quite gets that right at this moment in time. I think there's a lack of numbers. We know that they're probably a little short in numbers of the currently British Army. But what I will say is those individuals that join the British Army are joining for a reason. No one's under any illusions what the British Army does or how it goes about its job. You only have to watch a couple of months worth of the news and you'll see what sort of activities the British Army is undertaking on a regular basis. And I think that breeds a certain sort of individual in the first place. You are of a certain denomination mentally to join the British Army. I think the British Army then just tries to exploit it. I remember joining the army when I was a young 19-year-old. I'm now a completely different person. The first thing the army really does is whittle you down to your basic elements, really. For less of a better word, the army broke me as an individual and then built me into the person who they wanted me to be. And that was through the training they undertook, the leaders that I wanted to aspire to be, the team that I was working in, the lack of sleep, the food that I was eating. I mean, I was quite fussy eating-wise before I joined the army. 6 months of the army, if you put a plate of anything in front of me, I would gobble it down in 4 seconds straight. I still do now. I still eat on time, where everyone else in my family is like taking their time. I've scoffed everything and it's an empty plate. I'm waiting for more. It sort of reduces you down to your basic atoms almost, and then develops you into the person that they want you to be. And that creates, so it's not just about recruitment, it's about the training process to get there in the end. The training is hard, not just basic and phase 2 training, but all the training throughout your army career. And there'll be some people who really aren't up to that, maybe don't want to push themselves as far as the army wants us to push them out. And they're the ones that they'll just go by the wayside quite early on. It's a natural elimination, almost survival of the fittest to a certain extent.
Okay, thanks for that. Final question from me before I'll throw it over to Tim for questions from our delegates. And maybe Tony's got some questions as well. But if I start with you, Carl, and then Pete, if you follow on from this, resilience is very much a buzzword in today's society, especially given that the crisis that we're going through. One of you is currently in the army, that's you, Carl, and Pete, you've recently retired from the army. What is it about what you learnt in your experiences, either currently or in the past, which have made you resilient? What are the take-home messages that maybe the audience could learn from?
I don't know. I mean, resilience is a really broad term, isn't it? I suppose in order to be resilient, I suppose one of the things that we do, and we spoke earlier about fatigue and being able to operate for long periods of time in that state. But in order to do that, you kind of have to be prepared for it. So I suppose keeping yourself fit goes some way towards supporting that, and equally again it supports that kind of leadership, the leadership model, because people will judge you by how you look and how you act. So in order to be resilient, you have to be ready. I suppose one of the things that the military does teach us is that sort of preparedness, and it's not necessarily planning for every eventuality. But if you feel prepared and you think you are, then there's a good chance you'll get through something. And that's a bit wishy-washy. But that's probably as much as I can do on an individual level. I mean, in terms of making a business more resilient, I mean, I'm not suggesting that by any stretch you get them all out in the car park digging a hole and making them sleeping it for the night. That's not going to make them resilient. That's just going to make everyone resent you. But you can I suppose, practice in crisis potentially. So, for instance, if you're used to having everybody operating on IT systems, for instance, if you remove 2/3 of those IT systems and ask them to operate normally, then you're kind of building resilience by rehearsing it and practicing it. You're looking for innovative ways of operating normally in an environment that you're not comfortable or you wouldn't normally operate in. And that's kind of what we do in the army. A lot of the time, we kind of ask people to do exactly what we would expect of them, but in very difficult circumstances, with different pieces of equipment, working in mixed teams of people they're not comfortable with doing, and by removing all of their sleep and as Pete alluded to, some of their normality, a lot of those niceties disappear. So that's how you make, I think, how you would build resilience, or how you make an example of how you could probably cross some of the things that we do over into normal activity. That's okay?
Yeah, Pete, what are your thoughts?
From my perspective, the Army's got values and standards. Something that's drilled into you very early on in your Army career, and we call them the C drills. So courage, discipline, respect for others, integrity, loyalty, and selfless commitment. And I can still roll that off, Carl. How impressive is that?
Very good.
So you've got all these 6 values, and they're no different to, you know, I'm a big Burnley fan, so we've got hearts, legs, and minds. There's an acronym for clarets. Most companies do. They all have these acronyms or ways of their values. Well, the British Army is really good at doing is it sets a standard as well. So without a standard, a value is worthless. So you can have loyalty, but you can have loyalty in the wrong place. You can have discipline, but the discipline's in the wrong place. And what the Army is really great at doing is instilling that standard to that value. So, and it really sets the bar quite high. So self-sacrifice for the British Army is actual you throwing yourself on a grenade to save the rest of your team. It's getting up out of that trench and going over the top with a weapon system to go and kill the enemy, knowing that you could get shot as well, because the people behind you will have to do that if you don't. That's the standard that the British Army asks you to do. It always pushes you one step further. So I think having a value is great, but having a standard pushes it from normality. You know, thieves, there's honour amongst thieves, for example. Well, that's not the standard the British Army would want. It wants a higher level of understanding of that value. I've always been told, as an ex-military police, and Carl will probably agree with this, is that we always get called ruthless. We are absolutely ruthless to get to our objective. It does not matter what stands in our way, we will achieve that aim. It's not a problem. We will throw whatever resources and people at it until we achieve what we need to achieve. It's a trait that I've learned to be, and it's something that the Army has definitely instilled in me. There's other characteristics, planning. I'm a much better planner now. I understand second, third, fourth order effects, not just that there's a cause and effect, but what happens as a result of all the other effects of a simple decision. My organization, how I want things done. You know, I'll be early to a call, I'll be early to a meeting, I'll be early to meet, to do a presentation. I'll always be ready and prepared before the meeting. I will try not to play it by the seat of my pants. And probably the greatest skill that the Army has bestowed upon me anyway, is making things work. Regardless of whatever is happening, we fix it. The American Army call the British Army the borrowers, because we turn up with hardly anything working, black nasty strapped around everything that's not meant to move, and a bit of WD-40 to make everything that's meant to move that's not moving. And I'm asking the Americans to give us whatever we can to make our lives a little easier. But you know what? If the Americans aren't there and we've just got to get on with it, we do. We make things work. We just make it fit whatever the circumstances.
Thanks, Pete. Thanks, Carl. I'll pass you over to Tim now, who I'm sure has got some questions.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, brilliant. We've got some cracking questions. Some of them just been covered in the past couple of minutes, but might be a bit of clarity would work. So Sandy in London says, do you think the business of sport can learn from the military in regards to crisis leadership? And if so, how?
I suppose we kind of touched on it earlier, and as Pete alluded to, it's trying to avoid crisis wherever possible. So it's having a plan and kind of sticking to it. And if it's not working, it's being able to draw yourself far enough away from the problem at hand to be able to see it for what it actually is. That's how you come up with a workable solution or a workable plan to be able to overcome something. A crisis is quite a broad term. I mean, we're in one now, but we're all sat here quite calmly chatting on Zoom. So where is this crisis? There's not people running around in the background on fire. We're not in public order scenario. That's not that kind of crisis. So it depends on your situation and what you want to achieve. But I think if you are prepared, as Ian just suggested, if you are prepared and therefore more resilient, that will allow you to get through it a little bit easier. Potentially, someone will be in more of a crisis had they not prepared or not foreseen it. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I think it adds a bit of clarity to what, like you said, what we said before. I think, was there ever a time, Carolyn, when that you can speak of that sometimes you always find a way to make things happen, as Pete said before. You always, there's always a solution. At what point, in the industry, particularly sports, we're thinking, at what point do you stop and think, you know what, we've just got to learn from this and cut our costs. This has just got to fail, because some of the businesses, some of the clubs are in a real turmoil right now.
I don't know, really. I mean, I suppose in the military, we have a very different attitude to risk from industry or from the rest of society. So it's quite difficult for me to say, like, hand on heart, like where do you draw the line? I think you have to, again, you probably need to step back and look at everything and really appreciate what's going on. And like Pete said, you need to understand the consequence, not just the consequences of the immediate decisions that you're making, but how they're going to affect other people and other things, because a consequence never happens in isolation. So for instance, you've alluded to, so if it's financial turmoil, just pulling the plug on it, who does that affect and why? And what can you do to mitigate that if you are going to pull the plug? It's not just a matter of stopping and putting your hands up. Again, it kind of, I suppose, to coin the phrase again, it's about making yourself more resilient. It's doing what you can with what you've got to lessen that impact. Or equally, if you are really optimistic and like we would in the military, we'd probably just kind of blindly keep banging away at it in the hope that it would work. Maybe that is an option as well. Like if you can weather the storm, then weather it and come out the other side. But yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult. I mean, in a position personally at the moment, well, my wife's business has been struggling through the COVID sort of lockdown period, in a very similar position where you kind of continuing to pay out money with no income because of the lockdown. Yeah. So yeah, where do you draw the line?
So to it, I hope that gets better for you, my friend. I think everybody.
Yeah, no, I think we're there now. We've weathered the storm now, I suppose, and we've kind of buffered everything that we can. We've put as many mitigations in place as we can, and we just kind of had to say, let's just see what happens. I mean, there was this sort of, I suppose, collectively there was this talk of, by September everything will be back to normal. Well, one, what is normal, and what's going to happen in September that can't happen now? Yeah. So yeah, I suppose just be mindful of false hope and optimism. Kind of plan with what you know, and don't make big sweeping assumptions that you can't back up. I think that's one of the things that we do learn in the military. We work on assumptions quite a lot, but they need to be realistic. And I suppose, yeah, the conversations I've had with my other half about her business is kind of, you need to be realistic, and you need to be honest with yourself about what you want from something and how it's going to affect you and other people.
That's a really honest answer, Pete. I think if you were, you're a clear Burnley fan, and tell where your passion is, right? Just down the road from you, what's happened recently with Bury, it's a bit close to home, right? And considering what Carl just said, sometimes the military can continue on regardless until we achieve what needs to be achieved or achieve the objective. Is there something that can be learned from that, or is there something that we, perhaps it should be learned the other way around?
I think if you're looking backwards, there's a lot of decisions that probably didn't go in Bury's favour, which led to the downfall of that football club, and a lot of decisions that could have gone the right way or the wrong way. I think clear decision making. I think this is something we haven't spoke about as much during today as I probably would have liked to. Is that when we're tired, we're talking about the situation on Ant Middleton's celebrity SAS, and they tire them out and they make them all physical. But what they actually don't challenge, which is something that I always like to challenge, is the decision making and thought processes as a result of that. When they are tired, when they are almost defeated, can they still make the right decision? Can they still make the right choice? Decision making is such an important element of business and of football clubs. We ask players to make decisions on the pitch, split second. Do they keep the ball? Do they pass it? Do they play the way they're facing? Do they turn? All those sort of decisions, we sort of training them all the time. We talk about teacup, the old Clive Woodward theory, where you're thinking correctly under pressure. Remove the idea that people are having a decision to make because it's mainly down to muscle memory. Yeah. But when you come to business, I think it has to be more calculated, and there has to be a strategy behind it. And I think in the case of Bury, it's been coming a little longer than probably a lot of people can see it from the outside. The club itself was in turmoil for a while. And were those decisions being made the correct decisions for the club at that time? Or were they just trying to paper over the cracks and pretend the problem wasn't there? I think the decision making, if you're looking back on the situation, if you're looking forward, again, have people challenge your decision making processes. The army has a very large, diverse group of individuals that's in the army. We have officers and senior NCOs and warrants and junior NCOs. They all come from very different backgrounds. We've got the Gurkhas, we've got Fijian soldiers, we've got a lot of from minorities, and so as a consequence, decisions become a little bit better all-rounded because you can feed off all these different ideas. People get different points of view over. If you're looking in the boardrooms and you're looking at people who look exactly like you and at the same age, then I would suggest you're probably not getting the right answers because you're only getting it's almost a mirror. You're getting reflective answers back to you. And if you're getting those reflective answers, are they going to be challenged enough? And I would just suggest that maybe some football clubs need to look at how they're running their football clubs, who is in their boardroom, and are they being challenged enough? Is there enough red rooming in that on those major decisions that are going to cost money in the long term?
That's really good. Decision making is a massive part of it, isn't it? We talk about doing leadership, but actually the military does. The amount of times we've done that in the boardroom or in the classroom and stuff, and kind of, let's go and do some leadership. You can see the blank go over the faces. So Hannah's asked, it leads nicely in Hannah's question, which is, can you summarise the key characteristics of crisis leadership? And I know, Carl, you've already mentioned honesty, integrity, and being able to problem solve and having presence. But what else is there?
I think as in order to be a leader through crisis, you need to be that kind of figurehead. I think Dr. Ian sort of alluded to it earlier, kind of like that unicorn figure, but you need to be seen doing the right things. So you need to be calm when it's required. So if the room is in chaos, if you're in a boardroom or in an ops room, you need to be that one that's kind of taking a step back and just having a look at it. If you're embroiled in the chaos, then it's just going to spiral exponentially out of control. So people will physically look to you for leadership, and so you need to be calm. You need to be making informed decisions, and that's, I suppose, that's kind of one of the things that I would sort of take away. The people that do it really well, they're calm in chaos, or equally are able when the team is is not is calm, for instance, and you need them to do more, then that's when you need to be able to step up, and you need to change the way your leadership style to mirror that. So if you need more momentum from them, you need to physically instill that in them. Just telling them in a calm manner probably isn't going to get them going. You need to kind of live it and breathe it, and change your demeanour accordingly.
Okay, so a bit of flexibility in there. Would you add anything to that, Pete? Because I'm thinking where this comes in.
I just want to give a little bit of maybe something more grassroots. So in a section, the section commander, in a scenario where maybe you're in a contact or you're making decisions, the commander should take a condor moment. We talk about a condor moment, or taking a knee. So the old condor or Hamlet situation, you know, where and you go away, you sit on your knees, and you come up with the plan. Your 2IC, your second in command, deals with all the stuff in the section. It buys the commander some time, and that principle is the same when we do our planning for operations, is that all the sergeant major and officer commandants go away and do all the work with the soldiers to make sure that they're ready to go, and then those people who are making the plan can just concentrate on the plan itself. And I think a lot of the time, too many people have too many fingers in too many pies, and they're pulling themselves away from the decision. Instead of concentrating on that key decision, they're involved in everything else as well. And when you're multitasking, especially with these decisions, it can be a bit foggy and misty, and you can start making mistakes.
Okay, yeah, no, brilliant from both of you. I think the last questions now for Piero is like, you clearly demonstrated to be experts in leadership through conditioning, adversity, and the things that you brought through, just experience to live and breathe it. How do you as experts continue to grow and develop your skills to stay battle ready? Now you're in Civvy Street almost.
So I don't know, Pete, do you want to go first, because you've made the transition, whereas I'm still wrapped in the cotton wool bubble of pre-planned training activity.
What I would say is that no one's ever the finished article. No one's ever a complete leader. There's always things to learn. There's always people to learn from. There's always situations to grow from. Continual personal development is always a good way of continuing to develop as an individual. Reading, listening, talking. I do a lot of audio books. I listen to a lot of I listen to a lot of sports managers, mainly. Alex Ferguson. I love the leadership book by Alex Ferguson. And he has a little adage in there about leadership, and he takes it from the army. And so he took it from the army, and then he's given it back to the army almost to a certain extent. So there's always people to learn from. There's always people to decisions to learn from. No one person will ever say, I can make flawless decisions consistently and constantly. It's impossible. What we have to do is reflect, understand why we made that decision, and learn from that. I don't believe that many people make bad decisions because they're bad people. They make bad decisions because they're ill-informed, or they don't have the full picture. So often, it's just about making sure you know more, making sure you understand more, understand the situation more, understand yourself more, and then you can make better decisions. And that's how you grow as an individual.
Okay, brilliant. I think that's more or less it from this side. Tony, have you got any more that's come through by text or anything?
No, guys, you've covered the majority of the questions that came through there, Tim. So thanks for that. Carl, Pete, fascinating hour and 10 minutes that we've spent talking about various aspects of crisis leadership, and we really appreciate your time. I'm sure there'll be certain delegates that will be wanting to get in touch with you and take it a little bit further. So if you're okay with that, we can pass on your details, and you can catch up with them from that perspective. Ian, as always, thanks for hosting proceedings, and guys, we'll catch up soon. Thanks for your time. Thank you.
Okay, guys.